Hello and welcome to Radical with Amol Rajan. These are conversations about the deep global trends redefining this crazy era in human history and the radical ideas that you need in order to win the future. There is a lot going on the left of British politics. Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, those former Labour MPs, have set up a new political party. The Green Party of England and Wales has just elected Zach Polansky, an eco-populist. And our guest today, the political journalist, the Marxist commentator Ash Sarkar, thinks that the future for the left is in populism. She's written a new book called Minority Rule, in which she advises people on the left of the Labour Party to reject identity politics and to focus relentlessly on populism. And in this conversation, as you're about to hear, she believes that Karl Marx has a lot to teach the Labour Party still, and she believes that populism, especially of a kind that focuses on the economic interests of the majority, is the way in which the left and the left of the Labour Party can really acquire power in Britain. I want to rewind a little bit if I can, and I want to split this into two things, if I may, which is one, to talk to you really about radical ideas at the level of ideas, and then to come to some practical applications of that, not in terms of how you might have a communist Britain or a Marxist Britain, but in terms of where we're at in a week. We're speaking not long after Zach Polansky became the leader of the Green Party.
I just bumped into him downstairs.
Did you?
Yeah, I did.
What'd you say?
I said, heard you on Five Live, you did very well.
Because you live with a Green Party politician, don't you?
I do live with a Green Party councillor, Rory Payton.
Okay, and you voted Green in the last election?
I did, but I'm not a Green Party member. I'm not a member of any party, and one of the great things about being a journalist is that you get to criticise everything and pin your colours to nothing. It's so
Tell me
good.
about it. Welcome to Radical, Ash Sarkar. Well, Zach Polansky's going to have to work very hard to get your vote. There's one thing you are, and isms and labels are dangerous, but you subscribe to, I think I can say you're a Marxist.
Yeah.
You subscribe to the Marxist analysis of class and society and the way in which owning the means of production, which is a tiny part of Marxism, is really kind of the beginning of economics, which is in a way the beginning of politics. Just introduce, if you would, for us, your book and the thesis of it.
Cool. So I wrote a book called Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War. And what it is an attempt to look at is how, on the one hand, you've got these media scare stories, which no matter what the topic is, it's always the same. Here's a minority group. They're trying to tell you what to think, how to talk, how to live. They're trying to impose their will on you through some kind of illegitimate means, and trying to understand what that's doing in our media environment. And then trying to look at something which I think is genuinely happening, which is that you have this huge concentration of wealth and power at the very top. I'm not the first person to think about this. Of course, Martin Wolf in his analysis of the rentier economy. You've got Brett Christophers. You've got Yanis Varoufakis. All of us are trying to make sense of this phenomenon, which is we've got these individuals and corporations who are extracting far more from the economy than they're contributing to it.
And as I take it, reading your brilliant work and following you closely as I have done for many years, the minority rule is a pun, because the minority you're talking about is actually the wealthy.
Yeah.
And when we use the word minority, we often talk about ethnic minorities. You say the minority that matters is the wealthy, and you're an advocate of a form of populism because, as I see it or I understand it, populism is a politics of winners and losers, and you just want there to be more winners. And you want there to be you want the winners to be the masses, if you like. And at the moment, you think the winners are the few, the people at the top.
I mean, look, it's absolutely the case. Let's talk football, right? Because I'm a football person. The Glazers in their takeover of Manchester United, and I say this as a Tottenham fan, there's a degree of schadenfreude about it. They take over the club, they extract a load of money, they load it with debt, and then essentially kind of fuck off, all right? That's the same story with Thames Water and Macquarie, an Australian company. Come over, they buy Thames Water, load it with debt, extract loads of money for shareholders.
Okay, this is the extractive private equity kind of model, and the democratic response that you get from our current polity is that we've just had ineffective regulation. Utilities in this country poorly regulated since Thatcher. The football regulator that we're about to get, famously, should have done a job of making sure that the fans were represented. And you would say it's intrinsic to the capitalist model.
I think that ownership is it's so important as a power relation.
You and Thatcher.
Right.
Because Mrs. Thatcher said every earner an owner. She wanted to go from a nation of shopkeepers to a nation of shareholders. Maybe you're secretly you're not going to join the Daily Telegraph and do a podcast with Tim Stanley, but maybe you and Margaret Thatcher share the beginnings of an analysis.
Like I said.
Don't you disagree on the outcomes?
She's got a Marxist analysis, right? But she was using it in favour of the rich, right? I think with ownership, the ability to leverage, like, I own something that I don't need. My only need for this thing is that it gives me money. You need it because it enriches your life in the form of football, or you need it to survive, like water or shelter. That is a fundamentally unequal relation, right? Because you don't need money to survive, but you need water and indeed football to survive. And I don't think that regulation can get to the heart of it. And that's why, in so many ways, the UK is an outlier in terms of what we've allowed to be privatised. I mean, you compare us to Singapore, right? Low tax haven. They don't allow people to use land as a commodity. You can lease it from the state, but the state's going to own it.
They've got this weird centralised or autocratic control. It's almost socialist control of command centre of the economy. But minority rule, the title of your book, is a pun as well, because there's a capitalist critique there, as you might expect from a very clever Marxist, about the minority actually being the rich, not ethnic minorities. But your book is also about, as the subtitle gets into, where the left has gone wrong. And is it a trapdoor? Is it a dead end? I don't know what the metaphor is. Why is identity politics dangerous for the left?
I mean, so the first thing to say is that identity is always going to be important, right? Identity is where culture meets self. That's what it is. We're always going to have to contend with it in some way. For me, it's about what kind of importance do you place on it? And do you think of identity as being a useful dividing line between yourself and, the coalition you're trying to build and the big other? I don't think it is, because the thing about being an ethnic minority or a gender minority or something like that is you're just that, you're a minority, right? If the task of the left is to build up class power, to build up a coalition big enough and bad enough to take on vested interest, you can't do that as minorities. It's a numbers game.
So identity politics was, in that way, is intrinsically antithetical to solidarity.
Oh, I mean, I think it is. And it's also, I think, different from anti-racism, right? Because one of the things that I look at in the book is the way in which there is this attachment to the minority status and to the marginalised status, because it gives you cultural and social capital in certain settings. And I think that you saw this with David Baddiel's book Jews Don't Count, which I just thought, I'm sorry, I thought it was a trash book. Like, I've
not spoken to David about it. David, you're very welcome to come on this podcast and talk about why it's not a trash book.
All respect to David, but I thought it was a trash book. And the reason why is because when he's saying Jews don't count, it's like, well, count as what? What would it mean to count? And effectively what he's saying is, I don't think that this gets the same amount of attention or bandwidth. And also times when other forms of racism are being talked about, I feel shunted out of the picture. So it's not really about, okay, what do we actually need to build an anti-racist movement which can take on anti-Semitism, which is a perfectly legitimate and I think urgent question. It's instead going, how do I feel seen? So it's actually kind of neurotic, but he's not alone in it, right? Like at the same time, you've got people on the left saying things like, oh, if a trans person uses the slogan, say her name, when a trans teenager's been murdered. It's a slogan which was used during the Black Lives Matter protests when black women were killed in police custody. It actually has its origins in a campaign for justice for a white victim of sexual violence, but I digress. They're saying if you use the slogan as trans people, you're taking something from us, you're displacing us, you're erasing us. Again, this is a neurotic attachment to attention. It's not really about how do you create successful movements.
So I've not read Jews Don't Count or spoken to Dave. Have you spoken to him about it? I bet you'd have a fantastically productive conversation about it.
I actually messaged him because he misrepresented me in the first print run, and I got him to add some footnotes.
I bet you'd have a fantastic and productive conversation about it, and I think lots of people would love to listen to it. Anyway, the implication of what I think you're saying, certainly what you argue in the book, is that one of the problems with identity politics, which the left, or the liberal left, the Democratic Party in America, parts of the Labour Party in the UK, in your view, fall into is...
And my part of the left, the radical left as well. And I also want to say, I've done it. Like, I've done it. I have been that person going, actually, what about me? I've done that.
Is your beef with it, is your problem with it, that it inculcates and celebrates victimhood and grievance?
So, yes, victimhood, grievance, resentment, mistrust, suspicion, and a competition for attention. All of these things are corrosive to solidarity. And also, you end up with what my friend calls a Father Dougal problem. You know, here's the cow, it's small, but it's close to you. So I'm going to focus on this cow rather than the cow that's large and far away.
Why did the left, which has its origins in an economic class analysis, pivot to culture, belonging and identity?
I think there's lots of reasons for it. So one reason I think is the neoliberal destruction of the engines of class consciousness, trade union movement, council housing, heavy industry, that kind of thing. Because those weren't just economic institutions and political actors, they were also cultural engines. They make culture, they produce a worldview. So that's one thing. Second thing is the internet, right? My phone, my laptop is a mirror to the self. I'm constantly producing versions of myself and putting it out there, and I'm seeing how other people react to it. And I think because, again, we're such social creatures, we're fascinated by how other people view us. And
what's this got to do with the left pivoting?
Well, because it means that identity and the self becomes much more of a fixation.
Oh, and the left became too obsessed with that.
Right, way too obsessed. There's a third thing, which is more and more people go to university, and university becomes the place where you encounter politics for the first time. One of the people who invented the term identity politics, Barbara Smith, said, it's like they take the identity and leave the politics on the floor, because you're encountering it in an arts and humanities context where all you do is pick apart language, right? I was trained to pick apart language as an English lit.
So you perhaps become more of an anywhere rather than a somewhere. You perhaps encounter kind of cosmopolitan or pluralist views of the world because you meet lots of people that didn't come from your small town on the outskirts of Hull or Rochdale or whatever, right?
Sure, but also, like, I'm from Tottenham, right? Like, and I live in Tottenham. If you walk up the high road, you've got your Colombians, your Ecuadorians, your Caribbeans, your West Africans, your Poles, your Romanians, your Filipinos. You don't have to be university educated and middle class to be encountering lots of different kinds of people. I don't think it's quite that. I think it's about the practice of, how do you contest things in a seminar room? It's all language, no stakes. There's no stakes whatsoever.
So there's these two sort of, the two kind of quote unquote masses of post-war Britain. There's mass immigration, which is more of a last 25 years phenomenon, but there's mass education. In the 1960s, very few people went to university. Now close to half do. And that has kind of that's encouraged people in the left to do more picking apart of language than actually building trade union movements. That's your kind of...
Or not just trade union movements, that's one kind of political expression.
Or class consciousness and class
consciousness, or you could say, building organisations and institutions which have a life beyond the news cycle. So another component, why identity politics and why not class consciousness is because we didn't have a political education which could teach us how to build organisations and institutions.
When you look at the Labour Party, which is dominated at the cabinet level, though not the Deputy Prime Minister, but by graduates, including those who sort of studied and practiced law, and then you look at Nigel Farage, who was educated at Dulwich College, was a metals trader, and is part of the kind of late 80s, early 90s Eurosceptic movement. Does it alarm you that it appears that Nigel Farage's Reform Party is making a more direct appeal, and B, perhaps in the short term, based on polls, a more successful appeal to what we used to call the unionised working class?
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you why I can do it. Because you listen to Nigel Farage and you can tell he hates politicians. He hates them.
That's exactly the source of his appeal, isn't it?
Right, exactly. Because most people look at politicians and they go, you are getting money for nothing, right? What do you actually do for us, right? You do nothing. You serve your own interests. You break your promises. You lie like there's no tomorrow. We have no trust or faith in the political system.
Isn't that a corrosive cynicism?
Well, I think that
most politicians actually, sorry to interrupt, but most politicians, most of them are not getting something for nothing. Most of them are not.
Do you think they're doing a good job though? When you meet a politician, you talk to them.
No. But that's about competence, not malice.
Well, I think...
And the implication, I know it's yours representing Nigel Farage rather than your position, but I mean, if you want to stick up for democracy, don't you have to stick up for kind of flawed people trying hard, doing the necessary drudgery to get compromise, to get bits of planning legislation through? I mean,
but I just don't think that one, that is what they're doing. The second thing is that I talk about this in the book, right? Which is a friend of mine said if an alien came down to Earth and they were like, what's the most important thing to their species? They'd be like, finding really good footballers. We've got this global system that, you know, most men come into contact with, and, you know, we're looking for ball retention and agility and speed and all the rest of it, right? And this is reflected in the fact that, like, you know, when you see, unfortunately, no one who signed for Spurs, but, you know, when you see, you know, Mbappe or Lewandowski, you know, you're like, you're probably the best in the world at what you do. We found the right people. With politicians, the opposite is true. We go, you are somehow less conscientious, less honest, less intelligent, less empathetic than your average person.
less capable.
Right, less capable than your average person. So I don't think it's just people are angry at politicians as individuals, though I think that's true. There is the sense that this system is serving purposes other than this public good and the social good. And people are right to be angry about that. So I think it's only corrosive cynicism when you're blaming the wrong people. I think blaming asylum seekers and migrants as the wrong people. I accept there's a huge debate to have around immigration, but I think they're getting the blame for a lot of things which are nothing to do with immigration. And it's also corrosive and cynical if you feel like you can do nothing productive about it.
Do you think that Nigel Farage and Richard Tice and the Reform Party turning up at the launches of trade union events and saying they'll nationalise utilities and writing articles in right of centre newspapers saying we should make friends with trade unions, do you think that's corrosive and cynical by them? Or do you think that they actually, I mean, I'm not asking you to read their mind, but what do you think is going on there with this kind of, I suppose you might approve of the yearning for a leftist economics, but also why do you think that they are pivoting in quite an effective way towards this disenfranchised, what used to be the working class?
Because they're smart. They cut their teeth in the Brexit campaign. They saw the way in which Brexit was able to cut across traditional Labour Tory divisions in the Midlands and bits of the north of England. And they can see from the polling the levels of support for, you know, nationalisation of key industries. And they go, there's loads of voters here for us. There's loads of voters here for us. You know, if we're anti-immigration, but we're also coming across like people that want to privatise the NHS, we're losing those people. But for anti-immigration, and we can do some degree of economic populism or say we're going to do it, there are all these people who turn out for us. So they're smart readers of the electoral environment. For me, the astonishing thing isn't that Nigel Farage pivoted leftwards on some economic issues. It's that Keir Starmer let him by leaving that ground vacant.
What do you make of Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
What do I make of Keir Starmer's Labour Party? I can't think of a dumber group of people or a less strategic group of people. I'm not saying, you know, and if the left got there, like everything would be fine. Obviously, I believe in the left-wing cause, but I also just think that he's a terrible communicator, an awful strategist, and seems, you know, unable to speak convincingly on anything. I mean, him and Rachel Reeves, when it came to the means testing of winter fuel allowance, right? Regardless of what you think about the individual policy, just from a pure electoral strategy point of view, why are you going for pensioners? They vote, right? You've really, you could have done no worse by dropping an anvil on your foot, right? That's such a huge mistake. You know, the fact that their approach to things is so process led. There's very little in terms of outcome. It's very process. It's like, well, we're going to change the process for this. We're going to change the process for that.
Let me be radical and stick up for Keir Starmer. Not because I would genuinely do it, but because I
Give
think
him
it's
a fair
important to
hearing.
I think it's important. I think that's really important. I really believe in encountering ideas you disagree with and asking other people to do the same. First of all, you say an extraordinarily dumb bunch of people. Doesn't the Labour cabinet, which is the most working class cabinet or most state educated cabinet in the history of modern Britain, doesn't contain some people who've done remarkable things? You might not like them. You might think they're dumb. You
Like
might
what?
think they're ineffective. Well, got control of the levers of power.
Is it that hard?
Phillips. Yeah, maybe. I've never been an MP. Bridget Phillipson grew up on welfare in Washington near Sunderland. Got herself into a great university, got educated, became education secretary. Wes Streeting, experienced poverty, he's a health secretary.
What have they delivered though? What have they done? What's their record?
I'm certainly not pushing back on whether they've delivered or not.
No, I'm saying in other jobs as well. What have they delivered?
I put the same question to them all the time, but I don't necessarily think there's evidence from their records that they're dumb. Is the first thing I say. Second thing I'd say, which is definitely more of an objection to your radical recommendations for this country, is if you look at Labour's electoral record in the last 45 years, it goes lose, 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 Blair, 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 lose, 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 Starmer. And they might say to you, Ash, A, where's the evidence from that record that what the people of this country want is Marxism? And B, do you realise what an extraordinary achievement it is for Keir Starmer to inherit Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, turn it round and become Prime Minister?
All right, so I'm going to start first with the dumb thing. All right? What I mean by that is whatever incentives...
You mean politically inept,
right?
don't you?
Whatever incentives they seem to be working on, they're the wrong ones, right? They're the wrong ones. They don't know how to build a coalition that can keep them in power. Something Margaret Thatcher was very good at, something that Tony Blair was also very good at. Although I think that there were huge missed opportunities for him as well. And I'm not just talking about things which I think are morally wrong. I'm talking about things which I think are strategically wrong. When I'm talking about, I think you're a really dumb group of people, I stand by it. I mean, I stand by it just because you are, and people might think the same of me. Just because you're well educated doesn't mean you're smart, right? Just because you're well educated doesn't mean that you're good at making decisions and that you're good at thinking things through in a long-term way. An example is Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry, two very well-educated individuals who are very successful, in their professions of law. But when it came to talking about Gaza, immediately following October 7th, they went, Netanyahu has the right to cut off food, fuel, water. And now they're going, oh no, the starvation, it's so bad. Who could have seen this coming? Well, you should have been able to see this coming because millions of ordinary people could, and they could see that there was going to be, a crime against humanity, starvation of innocent civilians, women and children. Either you chose to ignore those facts, which I think is a moral stain from which people, don't recover from, or you are much dumber than other people.
Okay, that's the dumbness. What about the argument that the electoral record in this country since, say, 1969, 70, shows no evidence of an overwhelming appetite for Marxism?
So first thing that I would say in terms of Labour's electoral success in 2024 is that this huge parliamentary majority was delivered on very little actual support from the voters. So I think it was delivered on fewer votes than Corbyn got in 2019, just in terms of turnout.
By the way, it's a point I've made on this podcast, and I swear that you could argue that Starmer's got a majority but not a mandate, right, because quite low votes and yeah.
And so I think that there's something to be said for what, Starmer and his team were able to do was an exercise in voter efficiency, right?
Which is the distribution of votes under first
distribution of votes. They did that very, very well. And I think you can argue that Corbyn and his team did that really, really badly, particularly if you think about the lost opportunity of 2017. But in terms of thinking about what is their support for out there in the country, well, if you've got this huge parliamentary majority on not very many votes at all, and fewer than 2019, which is supposed to be, the nadir of Labour fortunes, what's that telling you about the support that's out there? I think there's another thing which is interesting to me, which is polling on individual issues like nationalisation or wealth taxes, is that there is broad support, not just amongst Labour voters, but Tory voters as well, for what you would consider quite left-wing economic ideas. And
things like public ownership of utilities.
Right. And what's striking to me is how little representation those ideas get in political parties. Now, if you're coming back to a Marxist analysis, I go, well, that's because these parties are serving the interests of capital rather than people. And so that's why you've got all these things that people support, but they never really see the light of day.
And we're speaking not long after Zach Polanski became leader of the Green Party. You bumped into him downstairs, and he's obviously going to have to work very hard for your vote. Can you just explain what you think is going on the left of British politics, beyond Labour, as it were, if you think Labour's broadly centre-left, but with Jeremy Corbyn's party and with the Green Party? And have you got any inside knowledge, perhaps from your housemate, of how they might work together to do real damage to Labour, even if they don't, get a big parliamentary representation?
So the first thing which I think is really interesting is that if you look at the Greens 2024 result, where they were coming second, it wasn't in rural constituencies
Bristol,
like Waveney Valley
big
and
cities, urban areas.
Hereford. It was traditionally left Labour voting urban constituencies, diverse communities, and also ones with large numbers of graduates and students. So this very slowly catchy monkey approach that the Greens have had so far, where they're trying to placate both a sort of rural, more conservative leaning electorate and an urban, more progressive one, is that if you give them equal value, the biggest loss of opportunity is going to be in those urban seats. So I think that's what Zach Polansky has looked at, and he's saying, okay, right, we're going to go all in on economic populism, and we're going to go for these urban seats where we came second. On the other side, you've got, your party.
Which is the name of the Jeremy Corbyn.
I think it should be called the Provisional Labour Party, but that's just me. But
that's a bit of an in-joke, but I get it. Yeah.
Bit of an in-joke, but I would laugh. Which is, this Corbyn and Sultana project.
Very new Labour?
Very, very new Labour. I can't believe it's not Labour.
I can't believe it's not Labour.
The name is sort of the least important part. What's really interesting to me is that they've had this really juddery launch, right? Where they sort of announce something and then there's periods of silence, and then they announce something, there's periods of silence. But in that time, they've had something like 600,000 sign-ups to an email list. Now, anyone who's been involved in electoral campaigns will tell you that data is worth its weight in gold. And if you've got an email list and you've got, say, a really good organising strategy, the world's your oyster. So what they do with that, how they deal with the fact that Zach Polansky is going to be going for the same voters as them, that all remains to be seen. There's no, constitution yet. There's no sense of here's how decision is going to be made. Here's how strategy is going to be set. There's lots of different political traditions at that top table.
And practical ones. One of the things that I think maybe people overlook, there's a kind of cliched way of looking at this from Monty Python, which is the people's front of Judea and the Judeans people front, and it's all kind of, often this is a stereotype attached to the left, that there kind of is big bickering over these different parties. Splitters and all of that stuff, which is quite fun. But there is actually a cultural difference in that the Green Party, as I understand it, has leadership elections every couple of years. Yeah. And is
too many.
Supremely deliberative, as the Lib Dems are in a way, with their kind of consultations about how they progress and how they come to a view on a particular thing. Jeremy Corbyn is a sort of parliamentary Bennite from a street protest Labour tradition bound up with the trade unions, actually. And he kind of comes out of 1960s politics in a way. And that's maybe a bit more, as a stereotype goes, I'm sure he'd disagree, but it's a bit more backroom deals. It's a bit more kind of organising committees, all that kind of thing. And it's not obvious that you could just plug one into the other, right? These are different things. By the way, with different leaders who have their own egos and followers.
Well, also, I think that there are differences within this new party as well. So it's
within your party.
Yeah, within your party. So it's said that Jeremy Corbyn favours sort of a federated model where you have lots of different parties. So, for example, Arise, who are operating in Harrow, maybe you've got something else going on in the northeast, and they sort of send delegates and they work things out like that. That's one way. There's another way of doing it where you have, okay, here is a national party. You're going to have one member, one vote. And this is how it's going to function. So how those things are sort of contested within your party and what the mechanism is for contesting it is, really remains to be seen. And I think that Zach Polansky becoming leader of the Greens, it should give this new party formation, a helpful and comradely kick up the arse, because the thing that exists always has an advantage over the thing that doesn't exist yet. And so you've got lots of people who felt very disenfranchised, who felt like, well, I can't support Starmer. I've been kicked out of the Labour Party. I'm worried about the rise of reform. I want my point of view to have political expression. I think they've been very patient with the idea, like, okay, something new might come. Maybe there will be an eco-socialist left-wing populist party. Well, now it exists and it's called the Greens. So you guys are really going to have to pull your finger out to say why it should be you and not this.
What's the role that you want to play in this new left?
Oh my God, I just want to write. I just want to write and provide analysis as honest and as candid as I can be about it. And I think that I talk about the importance of building institutions all the time. The institutions that I want to continue to build is Novara Media.
But what's the idea of Novara?
So the idea of Novara is that, we do news, commentary and analysis. We are open about our politics. We're all left-wing. We've got social democrats all the way to anarchists. And we think that, impartiality is impossible, but accuracy is an absolute. So that's the thing that we're trying to do, is that we're not going to be impartial, but you know who we are. We're very open about our partisan leanings, but accuracy, depth of research, fact checking, this stuff is non-negotiable.
And where does the name Novara come from?
It comes from a film called The Working Class Goes to Heaven, which is about the strikes in Italy in the 70s.
So with your kind of Novara broad left hat on, radical hat on, I know you're wary of programmes for the future, and I know you're wary of prescription, a bit like your, actually I call Marx your hero Marx, your idol Marx, your
Father.
inspiration, your father
Father.
Marx. If we were to think about where this is going in the next few years, how do you see this new left, this radical left in Britain panning out? There's obviously a question for how the Polanski, Corbyn, Sultana parties work together. There's a kind of emerging eco-populism, and there's a threat to left-wing populism, I guess you would say, from Nigel Farage doing it better than the Labour Party. But if you think about between now and the next election, probably 2029, what do you think is going to happen on the British left?
Okay, I'm terrible at predictions. I'm not going to predict. Instead, I'm going to say where they can draw inspiration from. So I think there is a huge problem in British politics, which is that there is just a chokehold on talent. And I think that's why, come on, like you look in the House of Commons, there are some people where you're like, I wouldn't trust you with safety scissors, right? I don't know, let alone having a role over legislation. And I've met MPs, because I started out in this job as a journalist going, your average MP is going to be much, much smarter than me, right? Because they have to be to have gotten here. And then I met some and I was like, Jesus Christ, you've got just a runny egg where your brain should be. I mean, like really, really, uncreative, uncritical people. And I'm talking about on all sides here. On all sides I've encountered them. And I think that one of the problems is that we have a very, very closed political system in the UK. We don't have open primaries. We make it really difficult for somebody who has got talent and ideas and drive to make it in politics. We say, all right, if you can sit through 6 hours of boring meetings a day, you'll be the candidate, rather than, are you really, really good at this? You contrast that to America, where rightly or wrongly, you might not like them, but a lot of them are really charismatic, talented people. And that's because there's a degree of openness to how they select their candidates. And so you end up with someone like Zoran Mamdani, who's currently running to be the New York City mayor. One of the things which I find so astonishing about him, and this is something which is useful for the UK left, is his message discipline. So I live thousands of miles away, and I know that his promises are
affordability.
Affordability. It's free childcare, free bus travel and rent controls.
That's using TikTok in particular for effective communication. Something Robert Jenrick's trying very hard to do.
But another thing that he does is that his video team don't actually come from politics at all. They're not used to making political videos, which
They're
is
snazzy marketers, yeah.
It's why they've got such a strong visual identity. But also he's able to quite effectively, he's a Muslim socialist who supports BDS, right? That would have been impossible.
What's BDS?
BDS is boycott, divestment and sanctions against the state of Israel. The fact that he's gotten as far as he has and hasn't just been drummed out of public life is extraordinary. I think that's because of how good he is at looping back to the things he really, really wants to talk about. And I think that there is something there for the left, which is, when marginalised people are attacked, we feel morally compelled to stand up for them. And that's good and that's laudable. But every time we do that, we become associated with minorities rather than majorities. We haven't been able to loop it back into the things where we do have a majority. And it's silly, but you see it with Bernie Sanders. If you ask Bernie Sanders, like, what do you think about trans people? He'd give an answer and he'd be like, but the most important thing is trans people are workers and they gotta buy eggs and da-da-da-da-da. Like, he would. Like, he's going to loop it back.
He does it with his right hand, doesn't he?
And trans people are part of the 99% and not the billionaire class. Like, he's going to say all this stuff. And I think that we can learn a lesson from it, which is we get so sucked into, like, we really, really want to defend these minorities. Morally, totally a legitimate and valid thing to do. strategically, every time we do it, we're being pulled away from speaking for 99% of people.
Why are you a Marxist?
Why am I a Marxist? For me, when I was a teenager and I was trying to understand why the world was the way it was, I didn't really find any convincing answers in liberalism, right? Because liberalism sort of says, well, the world is a product of individual choices. And I don't think that that really makes sense of why, people can vote against their own interests, or how there can be, huge groundswell of a mandate for a certain position that the government never takes. Like, none of these things really made sense to me. So I wanted some kind of analysis of power. And then the other bit was, I really thought that, like, if I sort of sat around reading philosophy books quite conspicuously, boys would like me. Didn't happen.
I thought the same with girls. Also didn't happen.
Didn't happen.
Maybe we should have met 20 years ago. Damn. Okay.
Just sitting there being like...
Yeah.
Oh,
here's me. I'm reading Hegel.
What's this? The Critique of Pure Reason? Oh, why?
Actually, the Critique of Practical Reason. The Pure Reason was a huge disappointment. But anyway.
I then read the Communist Manifesto, and it is written in a way to grab you. Right? It takes its inspiration from sort of sensationalist Victorian Gothic literature, and I was in. And for me, the core thing about Marxism, and I think you have to, Marxism is a living tradition, all right? Don't treat Karl Marx like an Old Testament prophet. The core part of it is, if you want to understand politics and why it is the way it is, look at the balance of class forces in society. And so I think that there are many politicians who aren't Marxists, but who took kind of a Marxist strategy to achieve what they wanted to achieve. So Margaret Thatcher, in order to achieve a neoliberal revolution where you've got deregulated markets, privatization, what she had to do was break down the engines of working class power, which was the trade union movement, heavy industry, and council housing. She quite famously said, and I took one of the chapter titles from this, in an interview with the Sunday Times, economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul. She understood that these economic forces change who we are as people. They change how we think of ourselves and how we think of those who are around us.
So annoyed you said that, because I was going to say it to you, and then you would have said that's the title of my book.
It was funny. I said that quote to Rory Stewart, and he didn't believe me that it was a Margaret Thatcher quote.
What does Marxism get right that liberalism gets wrong?
So I think the first thing is that Marx says, if you want to understand society, look at the balance of class forces. That is, I think, the most important thing. The second thing is what he called a science of history. So he was saying, okay, well, why is it you get the French Revolution when you do? Why is it that you get the American Revolution when you do? Why do these things shift from feudalism to capitalism? And he says, well, it's when you get a class which is big enough and strong enough to overturn the one above it. So, the sort of merchant class, the bourgeoisie class, these people who are deeply frustrated and under colonial America or, under the, ancien regime in France, they get big enough and they get bad enough to overturn the next one. And I think what people get wrong about Marx, and I think this is one of the things that the modern left gets wrong about Marx, is that he's not really a moralizer. He's not saying, and it should be like this, and these people are virtuous and these people aren't. He's saying, no, this is the group of people who are strong enough to do it. Whereas the modern left, we go, okay, well, we're going to organise the most marginalised people because that's the morally correct thing to do. It might be the morally correct thing to do, but I think Marx might say, well, that's unstrategic. I mean, he came up with the word lumpenproletariat for people like that, which wasn't very nice. So that was, again, something which liberals, they only understand it as one idea, one out against another idea. And I think it misses that sort of brute force class element.
I'm going to mention some books, and Lewis is not going to cut these book references out at all, are you, Lewis? My favourite non-fiction book is Francis Wheen's biography of Karl Marx. It is an absolutely extraordinary and brilliant book, and Francis Wheen is one of the best writers. And you mentioned the Testament prophets. There's a lovely line in Francis Wheen's biography where he points out that Karl Marx, like the carpenter of Nazareth, Jesus, was a Jewish outcast who says, the poor you will always have with thee. And there's this weird sort of symmetry between Jesus and Marx in one respect. They also had, Marx had a bigger beard.
I also think there's something about that, very Jewish tradition of argument and contestation.
Yes,
that
exactly.
You see in Marx.
Public argument as a way of kind of proceeding. One of the early bits of pushback I want to put to the idea of Marxism is one that John Gray, the kind of conservative realist philosopher, would come up with, which is that he would say that Marxism, Hegel's thinking, Christianity, they're all basically, and the delusions of progress, they're all basically based on the same illusion, which is the illusion that history has a direction and a purpose. And actually, we're just clumps of matter caught up in this mad Darwinian struggle who are sitting like, adrift on history.
Chimps with anxiety is how I
Chimps with anxiety.
It.
Why do you think that history does have a direction?
See, I'm not always sure that history does have a direction. I mean,
Okay.
Marx sort of lays it out, which is inevitably, one class will get big enough and strong enough to overthrow the one above it. And from his, stance in 1852, he's like, that's going to be the industrial proletariat. Spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. And actually where you do have revolutions, really interestingly, is in these peasant economies in Russia, in China, so that is in itself this rebuke to Marxist theory.
Can I put to you, in the spirit of Reithian impartiality, some objections to Marxism and see what you say? The first is that there's an objection which says that Marxism is impossible to reconcile with human freedom and the yearning to be free. And obviously, how you define freedom and liberty is very, very varied and complex. But what do you say to people who say that ultimately any Marxist system is going to impose on people limits to their autonomy and ability to pursue their own ends, their own goals for them and their families, which will make it unworkable?
Well, look, there's a balance to be struck here. I think that the nature of living in human society means that there are limits to your autonomy and to your freedom all the time. We can't do exactly what we want because we've got to consider the good of the people around us, all right? We already have to live with that in some way. The thing I would say is that the tradition of Marxism I come from, libertarian Marxism, very influenced by Franco Berardi, the autonomists in Italy, it takes those what you might call liberal freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of publication, freedom of assembly, really, really seriously, and goes like, yes, we can have Marxism and collective responsibilities, but these, what you might call liberal freedoms, have to be also central to it. They're really, really important. And the last thing I'd say is that we have a very limited kind of freedom in this society, all right?
Currently, our society.
I think we've got a really limited kind of freedom. I'm not even going to go into all of the clampdowns on freedom of speech that we see, all right? Because I think that's obvious.
Well, in your book, which is interesting, yeah.
But also, we think of consumerism as a form of freedom, but actually it takes away other kinds of freedom and other kinds of choice. The existence of consumerism means that I can choose between infinite pairs of trainers, made in a sweatshop somewhere. But I can't choose to live in a world where you don't have like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I can't choose to live in a world where the cleanliness of air and of water, is sacred. I can choose myself. I can choose myself not to look at porn. I don't have the choice to live in a world which isn't shaped by porn or the expectations set by porn. So all of these things are quite limited. It's saying, well, you've got freedom over kind of what you do as a little atomized individual. But in terms of collective freedoms, the sort of freedom to shape what kinds of conditions you live in, that is highly, highly, highly curtailed.
What about the argument that actually the system of economics that has given that to the most people is global capitalism over the last 25 to 30 years? If you look at the mass movement of tens, hundreds of millions of rural, dare I say it, peasant Chinese to urban conurbations, or if you look at what happened in India. In 1991, Manmohan Singh, who's finance minister of India, later the extraordinary Sikh prime minister of India, he basically liberalised India, opened it up to global markets, plugged in hundreds of millions of workers, and saw an extraordinary rise in not just GDP across India, but GDP per capita, and transformed the lives of almost more than any other leader in modern history through capitalism.
So, I mean, there's an interesting thing there about at what cost, and Marx talks about this.
At what cost? Well, for hundreds of millions of people in China and India over the last 20 years.
Just on this, like very, very quickly, what I mean is Marx himself talks about capitalism as being one of the most generative, creative, revolutionizing forces that has ever existed in human history, right? So I completely accept these things that you're saying, but there are also costs with it. One is a huge ecological cost, right? That we as a human species don't seem to be able to get a grip on. We are slowly and ever more quickly killing ourselves with climate change because we've unleashed this force that we can't seem to put back. Right?
And it is largely, just in terms of carbon, it is largely rich pollutants and poor people pay the price.
Right. So I think that's one thing, which is like, yes, you have seen this huge reduction in absolute poverty, but there is an ecological cost. There is another one which is about, I suppose, when you have these, huge waves of urbanization, you also have loss of kinship, loss of, family life, loss of support, increases in anomie, in depression, in feelings of separation from your fellow man. Marx puts it as, all that is solid melts into air. All these things that you think you value sort of evaporates into the ether. That is also an element of capitalism. And I also think that there is something which is Jodie Dean writes about very, very well, which is, yes, the history of the Soviet Union is the history of the gulags and purges and the security state. It's also the history of going from serfdom to outer space in, the course of a single lifetime or a lifetime and a bit. Which is one of the things which is rarely looked at, or the history of the Soviet Union in terms of economic development and infrastructure projects in the global south. And this was, of course, the role of the non-aligned movement to sort of play off Washington and Moscow to get the best sort of deal in the 20th century. So I think there are aspects of the history of development where we don't look at the role of communism and communist powers. And also I think we need to look at the sort of unleashing of potential that capitalism does in its fullest context as well, and take into account the ecological price.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Marxism is this living instrument, so it's absurd to apply. It was 1848, but actually, Communist Manifesto was 1848? Yeah.
It was just after the revolutions of 1848.
Yeah. And it's absurd to apply Marx writing then. He wrote often living in Dean Street in Soho, as Francis Ween's brilliant book.
Also off his face most of the time. Like, can we just appreciate...
Carbuncles on his bottom, pissed all the time.
All the time.
Him and Engels, he lived most of his life in terrible debt to Engels, who was his benefactor, and he would go up and down the Tottenham Court Road off his nuts, basically.
He would have loved Twitter. I always think Karl Marx would have loved Twitter.
He would have loved
it,
yeah. So do you go along with the idea, it sounds maybe banal and obvious given how you started out, but you go along with the idea that we just need to begin with this sense, if you're thinking about the future of the left, that the working class ain't what it used to be?
Oh, 100%. And one of the sociologists who I cite in the book is a guy called Dan Evans, and he wrote a book called Nation of Shopkeepers, The Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie. And one of the things that he starts with, because he's a Marxist sociologist, he's from Porthcawl in Wales, and he was starting from the position of thinking about what his sort of like urban graduate left-wing comrades were saying about class and the kinds of people that he grew up with, like what their actual conditions and working lives were like, and seeing that there was this big gap. And what he says is that Marx predicted that the artisan class, right, the self-employed class, that they would diminish and sort of fall into the ranks of the industrialized proletariat. That's not what's happened in this country. We've seen this huge rise in the number of people who are classed as self-employed. And what's interesting about that, Dan Evans says, is that you can sort of separate it into two groups. So on the one group, you've got your kitchen fitters, your scaffolders, your nail techs, hairdressers, brickies, electricians, all of that kind of thing. And then on the other hand, you've got downwardly mobile graduates living in cities. They've got laptop jobs, right? So it could be graphic design, could be freelance copy editing, could be something like that. Like picture the sort of fixed gear bicycle in your head, and you've got that person. What's interesting is that both of these people are self-employed. They occupy part of the same economic class, but culturally, geographically, politically, dispositionally, they're really, really, really different. And I think that the left, if you're a proper Marxist and you're like, all right, I need to look at class conditions in this society, you have to look at, what Dan Evans calls the rise of the new petty bourgeoisie, right? You have to really examine like who these people are, how they live, the sort of texture of their lives. I mean, this is an idea from Bourdieu, right? The habitus, the life world that they live in.
Habitus is about the idea of cultural capital, isn't it?
Well, so cultural capital is sort of separate but related, right? So habitus is your life world. It's like all the things that you do. So one of the things that Dan Evans cites as part of the habitus of your sort of, your plumber, taxi driver, electrician is carry cash everywhere.
Right.
Carry cash, right?
Right.
An urban graduate doesn't carry cash, right? Everything's on card. Like these like little
And that
things.
card's now on a phone, yeah. Do you think there's a playoff between solidarity and diversity?
It is really difficult to do what the left has done for the last 15 years and say we're going to take the most marginalised person, right? So, your female, queer, immigrant, Muslim, disabled, blah, 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 and say, because you're so marginalised by all these points of your identity, we're going to make you, by virtue of those identity characteristics alone, we're sort of going to make you the centre of our movement. Because that person is a legitimate part of the coalition, right? They're a legitimate political actor, but by their very nature, they're not going to be representative of most people, right? And there's also a bit about how this relates to Marxism, which is, do you want to defend the weakest in society, or do you want to organise those with the best chance of transforming society? So the Belgian Workers' Party, for instance, they came out of a communist party in the 1950s. They do really interesting work. Like as a party, they run health clinics because their thinking is we've got to demonstrate our usefulness to the community before we ask for their vote. One of the things that Peter Mertens says, who's their leader, is, look, you kind of have to organise around the strongest part of the working class and not the weakest. Just like strategically, that's the thing you've got to do.
Peter Singer's view of Marx, and I wonder if it's yours, is that Marx was better at description than prescription.
Oh, yeah. He said, I won't write recipes for the cookshops of the future. And
people in the world of politics would say, I mean, one of them would say having your cake and eating it too, which is, I guess not, I mean, he wasn't a Marxist, but he would say that's when Marxism falls short, which is in its confrontation with reality. I mean, I know you're not a huge fan of David Lammy and Keir Starmer, and David Lammy's kind of idea of progressive realism, but they would say that real politics, which is the politics not of the seminar room and the podcast, but the politics of the messy compromises of the street and democratic coalitions, requires, yes, compromise, but also requires a kind of engagement with the fact that lots of people disagree with you and you have to try and mobilise them as well as your own supporters.
And look, I think that, they've got maybe perhaps a sort of Weberian view of politics, right? The low, slow, the long, slow drilling.
They need a reading list, aren't we? Going to need a reading list, Lewis. A reading list. There'll be a reading list at the end of this podcast for our listeners.
Max
Weber we're talking about.
Yeah, he writes in Politics as a Vocation, right? That he was very sceptical of the sort of romance of revolutionaries. And I think you're right that Marx gives you very few instructions for applied politics, but luckily we're not only reading Marx, and we don't
live in 1848.
I mean, there's a really interesting thing if you sort of think about the bibliographies of different writers, right? Marx is in conversation with economists, but Lenin is in conversation with Clausewitz, and he's sort of applying military
Karl
tactics.
von Clausewitz, a famous military theorist.
And so what Lenin is doing is that he's taking the sort of framework, the intellectual framework of military strategy and applying it to politics. And I think that we can all agree Lenin got the job done that he set out to do. So I think that, you're right in terms of thinking that Marx isn't
prescriptive, really.
He's not prescriptive, but there are other Marxist and Marxist-inflected writers and thinkers and figures who are.
I just want to put to you, not because it's my view, but I want to put to you the argument that lots of people who see themselves as champions of the working class, people who have very different politics to you, Tommy Robinson perhaps, but their argument is that what has really destroyed the working class in many, many parts of our cities is the mass influx of people from different cultures, some of them really, many of them law-abiding, wonderful people, but different people from different ethnic minorities who essentially have undermined the social solidarity of the old working class.
So I think on that, I think there are elements of truth and I think there's elements of bullshit. So the first thing is that if you want to look at things strictly through a class lens, you have to acknowledge that immigrants coming to this country are working class themselves. What does Marx say? The working class has no nation. All right. So you also have to look at the sort of exploitation of labour on a global scale. And he's sort of saying, this is the terrain of politics. It's huge. It's a class terrain, not just a national one. But accepting that we have to work within the polity we have. The polity we have is the nation state. I think that there are, certainly elements of truth that when you have lots of people coming, lots of different languages, lots of different cultural perspectives. That work of going, how do we create a shared political point of view?
Solidarity.
To organise is difficult, right? It's well, not necessarily difficult, but this is a challenge in it. It's a challenge in it. And I think that's totally fair enough. The thing is that, the history of the trade union movement in this country is really contested, right? It wasn't as if the trade union movement were like, brown people, great, join. There were fights, but black and brown people did participate. You think about, Bristol bus drivers, for instance. You think about the Grunwick strike, who are these, little Asian ladies who were, going on strike in a photo development factory. Then you had Scargill and the National Union of Mine Workers coming down from Yorkshire. You've got lesbians and gays support the miners, right? Very different kinds of people joining in solidarity. The thing about solidarity and diversity is that, solidarity is the tool we have as leftists to overcome human differences. Right? You wouldn't need solidarity if you were all the same. You'd just be the same. But differences, whether it's sexuality, geography, culture, ethnicity, solidarity is the tool that we have to bridge those gaps. And I suppose this is where I am a humanist, like at heart.
Well, John Gray, who doesn't like humanism, would say that it's an article of faith, that you believe you can, through solidarity, overcome human differences. That human differences is such a fundamental, irreversible, tangible fact of our existence. Not just human differences, but the differences in our aims, goals, desires, ambitions. That the attempt to overcome it through solidarity was always fanciful, but is now utterly implausible given mass demographic change.
Well, look, the thing is that I don't think you can necessarily overcome all human difference, right? It's about where can you have a state of sort of like rubbing along and sort of, healthy contestation. I'm with Aristotle, right? He thinks man is inherently a political animal.
I'm with Aristotle on almost all things.
On
The
almost all
Nicomachean
things.
Ethics and my Communist Manifesto for you, I think the Nicomachean Ethics and the idea of virtue is my secular morality.
I just think that man is a political animal, right? Like, because we're so social, because we depend on each other for our survival, we have to contest things, and it can be really difficult. And I just think it's part of who we are. But I don't think that race or ethnicity has to be the dividing line of difference. I mean, firstly, the fastest growing ethnic group in this country is mixed race people. What does that tell you, right?
Like my children.
Right. I mean, I'm in a family where everyone has had a marriage which is mixed either by religion, race, or both. Every single person. And my theory is that we just want all the cuisines. We just want all the cuisines in the family.
I've got two final questions. One is, what does it mean to you to be radical?
I don't know. I don't really think about it that much.
You described yourself as radical several times, and I don't think you did that just because you're on a podcast called Radical.
I'm trying to think about. Do I think about?
I think a lot of
radical?
other people would describe you as radical. I'm interested in.
Angela Davis says that the
one
word
for the book, one for the list.
right.
Mate.
Stick on the list.
Stick it on the list.
She describes being radical as to grasp at the root of something.
But that's where it comes from. It comes from Latin for the root. Yeah.
And that's what I try to do in my writing and my thinking. And I don't always get it right. I think that just like everyone else, I can be prone to distraction or looking at something at the surface level. But the thing that I really strive to do in every aspect of my work, whether it's writing or whether it's, steering Novara Media to what it could be, it's about getting to the root of something.
Why is it good to be radical?
Why is it good to be radical? Because I think all of us know that the way things are, it's not the best way it could be. And I think there's a restlessness about being human, this restlessness about us, this striving for something more, for something better, for the widening of horizons. And I think that to be radical and to think about, what are ways in which we can transform our social conditions and use our agency and to flourish, I think that's how we tap into the essence of our species.
Such a pleasure chatting to you.
It's really nice talking to you.
It's really nice talking to you. And the book is called Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War.
It is.
What's
There's
the
a
next
paperback edition coming out as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to chat to you.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ash Sarkar, who's such a wonderful and reflective Marxist who's thought very deeply about the British left and about the past, present and future of this country. I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you did as well. But I do want to clarify something that she referred to when she was talking about what Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry had said in relation to Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu's right to cut off food, fuel and water. And in fact, it was something that they had said in separate interviews in the days after those horrific attacks on October the 7th. And I actually just want to really spell this out so that you're clear and you've got all the facts. So in an interview with LBC on the 11th of October 2023, 4 days after those attacks, Starmer was asked if cutting off power and water was an appropriate response from Israel. And he said, and I quote, this is Keir Starmer, "Israel does have that right, but it is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts." After facing criticism, Starmer denied that he said Israel had the right to cut off power and water and said he was actually referring to Israel's right to defend itself. And then separately, in an interview the following day on Newsnight, this is now the 12th of October 2023, Thornberry was asked if cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law. And Thornberry said, "I think," this is a quote, "I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism." My colleague Victoria Derbyshire, the presenter at BBC Newsnight, said, "That's not the question I asked." And Thornberry responded, "It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time." So there you go, small clarification about what Keir Starmer and Thornberry said, Emily Thornberry said in the wake of those attacks on October the 7th. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Radical with Amol Rajan. Remember, there's a new episode every single week, and if you want to listen on the move, you can hear this as a podcast. Just head to BBC Sounds, search for Radical with Amol Rajan, and hit subscribe, and whack on your push notifications as well. We'll be back at the same time next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for watching, and goodbye.